before there were 7 kingdoms. Time there was only blood. Imagine a continent so vast, so brutal that even its gods demanded sacrifice. A land where kings didn't just rule, they conquered, they burned, they bled. Where the greatest throne ever built wasn't made of gold or silver. It was forged from the swords of defeated enemies, melted together by dragon fire so intense that men said you could smell burning steel from a mile away. That throne killed more people than any war ever did. And the men who sat upon it, they were not legends. They were not heroes. They were something far more dangerous. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the history of Westeros is not a story about power. It's a story about what power costs, and the men who paid that price in full. Before we talk about the kings themselves, you need to understand the world they inherited. Westeros is not one kingdom. It never was. For thousands of years, this continent was a patchwork of warring regions. The north with its ancient honor, the Reach with its fertile fields and knights, the Westerlands with its mountains bleeding gold, the Stormlands lashed by eternal storms, the Riverlands carved apart by every army that ever marched south, dawn baking under a merciless sun, and the Vale perched behind mountains so high that winter itself could not climb them. 7 distinct cultures. 7 distinct cultures, 7 distinct peoples, 7 distinct ideas about what it meant to rule. Nobody agreed. Nobody wanted to agree. And then, from across the narrow sea, came a family that didn't ask for agreement. They brought dragons instead. His name was Aegon Targaryen. And the moment you need to understand about Aegon is this. He didn't need to conquer Westeros. He chose to. Aegon was Lord of Dragonstone, a volcanic island off the eastern coast. He was wealthy. He was safe. He had 3 dragons, 2 sister wives, and more power than most men could dream of. He owed Westeros nothing, and Westeros owed him nothing. But in the year 2 BC, before conquest, Aegon climbed to the top of Dragonstone, stared west across the water, and made a decision that would reshape an entire world. Nobody knows exactly why. The Maesters argue about it still. Some say he had a prophetic dream, a vision of the long night returning, of darkness swallowing the world, and only a united Westeros standing against it. Some say it was pure ambition. Some say his sisters pushed him toward it. The truth? Probably all 3. What we know is what he did next. He landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with a small force, and he sent ravens to every lord and king in Westeros. The message was simple, almost insultingly simple. Bend the knee or burn. Most of them chose fire. Aegon rode Balerion the Black Dread, a dragon so enormous his shadow could swallow entire towns. When Balerion opened his mouth, the flame wasn't orange. It wasn't red. It was black and deep gold, hot enough to melt stone, to fuse swords together, to turn castles into slag. At the Field of Fire, Aegon met the combined armies of the Reach and the Westerlands, over 55,000 soldiers, the largest army ever assembled in Westerosi history up to that point. The 9th of the Reach, and Loran the Rob the Rock, both kings, both confident, both certain that numbers would win the day. They had never seen 3 dragons fight together before. 4,000 men burned to death in a single afternoon. King Mern IX died in that fire, the last of House Gardner. His entire dynasty ended in hours. King Loran survived. He bent the knee. And Aegon, and this is the detail that defines him, let him live. Let him keep his castle. Let him keep his title. Aegon was not interested in extermination. He was interested in unity. He built his capital at the point where he first landed, the confluence of the Blackwater and the bay. He called it King's Landing. And on Aegon's high hill, he built a throne, not from gold, not from gold. He melted down the swords of his defeated enemies, 1,000 blades by the songs, and fused them together with Balerion's flame into a twisted, jagged, asymmetrical seat of black iron. The Iron Throne. It was ugly. It was uncomfortable. It cut kings who sat carelessly. Aegon himself, the man who built it, was cut by it regularly. He bled on his own throne. The Maesters say that was intentional, that Aegon believed a king who sat too comfortably was a king who had stopped paying attention. He ruled for 37 years. He unified 6 of the 7 kingdoms through fire and negotiation. Only Dawn held out, and Dawn would cost his descendants 100 years of blood to bring into the fold. When Aegon died, he left behind a united continent, a new dynasty, and a throne that would destroy almost every person who ever sat upon it. Rating him on power? There is no scale. Aegon doesn't sit on the list of powerful kings in Westeros. Aegon is the list. Everyone else is a footnote in his story. Jaehaerys the Conciliator, the king they forget. Here is a name that most casual fans of Westerosi history overlook, and that is a crime. Jaehaerys I, the old king, the Conciliator. He ruled for 55 years, longer than any Targaryen before or after. He came to the throne at 14 years old, after 2 of the worst reigns in Targaryen history had nearly torn the kingdom apart. His uncle Maegor, we'll get to that monster shortly, had ruled through pure terror. Before that, his father Aenys had been too weak to hold what Aegon built. The realm was bleeding. The faith militant, the military arm of the Seven's religion, had been at war with the crown. Lords were restless. The small folk were starving. Jaehaerys was 14, and he fixed it. Not with fire, not with fear, with conversation. He negotiated a peace with the High Septon that ended a generation of religious warfare. He worked alongside his Queen Alysanne, one of the most remarkable women in the history of the continent, to reform laws, build roads, improve the lives of ordinary people. Queen Alysanne personally convinced lords in the north to abolish the practice of First Night, a feudal abuse that had lasted centuries. Together, Jaehaerys and Alysanne traveled the entire kingdom. They listened, they judged, they governed. Under Jaehaerys, the Grand Maester system was formalized. The small council was professionalized. The legal code was standardized across 7 kingdoms for the first time in history. His reign was so stable, so prosperous, that the generation who lived through it called it the Golden Age. Here's the tragedy of Jaehaerys. He outlived almost everyone he loved. He had 13 children with Alysanne. 9 died before him. His wife died before him. His friends, his advisors, the people who had built his reign alongside him, gone one by one until the old king sat alone on his throne, barely able to speak, surrounded by people who had never known the man he used to be. And because he outlived everyone, he made the catastrophic decision of his life. He couldn't decide who should inherit the throne. He called a great council, a gathering of nearly every lord in Westeros, to settle the succession. The main claimants were his grandson, Viserys, through his son Balon, and his great-grandson, Leone, and his great-grandson, Leonor Velaryon, through his granddaughter, Rhaenys. The council chose Viserys overwhelmingly, favoring the male line and proximity over strict primogeniture. That decision, made by an exhausted old king trying to prevent civil war, planted the seed of the worst civil war in Targaryen history. But we'll get to that. Jaehaerys' power wasn't in his dragons or his armies. It was in something rarer and more durable. He was competent, and in Westeros, competence is the most dangerous weapon of all. Maegor the Cruel. Power without mercy. We need to talk about Maegor. Because Maegor is the answer to a question that nobody wants to ask, but everyone needs to understand. What happens when a king has all the power and none of the restraint? Maegor I, known to history as Maegor the Cruel. And understand, that nickname wasn't given by enemies. It was given by people who served him. Maegor was the second son of Aegon the Conqueror. He was massive, physically imposing, a warrior of terrifying ability. He could fight in full plate armor for hours. He once killed a knight so completely that the man's family had trouble identifying the body. He was also, by any reasonable measure, a monster. When the faith militant rose against his brother King Aenys, Maegor didn't negotiate. He hunted. He burned septs, the churches of the Seven, with his dragon Balerion. He fought the poor fellows and the warriors' sons with a ferocity that horrified even hardened knights. He became king through naked usurpation, and when his nephew Aegon the Uncrowned challenged him by raising banners and marching on King's Landing with an army, Maegor met him in the skies above the God's Eye, riding Balerion the Black Dread against Aegon's dragon. Quicksilver. In a single, cataclysmic clash of fire and wings, Maegor slew both rider and mount. Aegon the Uncrowned fell to his death in the dark waters below. That was the nature of Maegor's violence. It didn't happen at sword's length. It happened from above, from the back of a dragon the size of a city block, with fire that left nothing to bury. He executed the builders of the Red Keep, every mason, every architect, every laborer who knew the castle's secrets, so that the hidden passages and dungeons would die with them. He practiced blood magic, according to whispered rumors. His 6 wives produced no living children. Some said because of curses. Some said because of something darker in Maegor himself. His lords lived in constant terror. Accusation was as good as conviction. A man who angered Maegor in the morning was dead by afternoon. And here is the most chilling part of Maegor the Cruel. He worked. His realm was orderly. The roads were safe. Criminals were terrified into compliance. The faith militant was crushed so completely that it would not rise again for another century and a half. Fear, it turns out, is an extremely effective governing tool, until it isn't. Maegor was found dead on the Iron Throne one morning, his wrists slashed open, his robes soaked in blood, and according to some accounts, a spike from the throne itself driven through the back of his neck. The maesters still argue whether it was suicide, murder, or the Iron Throne itself that finally claimed Maegor the Cruel. Nobody believed the official story. Nobody tried particularly hard to find the truth. But here is what they don't argue about. When Maegor died, the realm celebrated. Lords who had bent the knee in terror raised banners against his memory the moment he was cold. Cities held festivals. A king so feared that his death was a holiday. That is the lesson of Maegor. Power without legitimacy is not power at all. It's just borrowed time. The Dance of Dragons. When the throne destroyed a dynasty. Before we talk about the kings who came after, you need to understand the event that broke the Targaryens. It began because of that choice Jaehaerys made, setting aside the female line for the male. His grandson, Viserys I, inherited the throne, and Viserys had a daughter named Rhaenyra and a son from his second marriage named Aegon. Viserys chose Rhaenyra as his heir, publicly, repeatedly. He made his lords swear to it. When Viserys died, the lords around his son Aegon crowned the boy king instead. What followed was a civil war between 2 Targaryen factions, the Blacks supporting Rhaenyra, the Greens supporting Aegon, each with dragons, each with armies, each absolutely convinced they were the rightful ruler. It was the most catastrophic event in Targaryen history. Dragons killed dragons. Dragon riders died by the dozens. The magnificent creatures that had made the Targaryens untouchable were systematically slaughtered by each other, by wildfire, by desperate acts of men who knew they couldn't win any other way. By the time the war ended, most of the dragons were dead. The Targaryens won the civil war, but they won a hollow victory. Without dragons, they were just another noble family with a fancy chair. Every king after the dance sat on a throne, built by ancestors more powerful than themselves, ruling with tools those ancestors had already broken. And the slow decline of the Targaryen dynasty begins here. In the ash of dragons killing dragons over a throne neither side was worthy of. The Mad King. Power at its most dangerous. His name was Aerys II. And Aerys Targaryen is proof that the most dangerous thing in Westeros isn't an army or a dragon. It's a king who has lost his mind but hasn't lost his throne. Aerys began his reign with promise. He was charming, intelligent, enthusiastic. His friend Tywin Lannister became his hand of the king, and together they seemed positioned to restore Targaryen glory. Then something broke. Some blamed the imprisonment. Aerys was held captive by a rebellious lord for months, and the experience shattered something in him that never healed. Some blamed paranoia that was always there, waiting. Some blamed the whispers of advisors who fed his worst instincts for their own gain. What we know is what he became. Aerys became obsessed with fire, with wildfire, a magical substance that burned green and hot enough to melt stone, that water could not extinguish, that spread on contact. He had the pyromancers produce it by the thousands of jars. He hid it beneath King's Landing. He burned people, not as execution, as entertainment, as pleasure. He watched men burn, and his face, witnesses said, changed, relaxed, smiled. He said, again and again, watching flames consume a screaming man, burn them all. His relationship with Tywin Lannister collapsed. His relationship with his son Rhaegar was distant and poisoned by suspicion. The court that surrounded him grew smaller, quieter, more afraid. When Robert Baratheon's rebellion came, when the lords of Westeros finally rose against him, Aerys's response was exactly what you would expect from a man who had spent years worshipping fire. He ordered King's Landing burned, all of it. The million people living in it. The buildings, the markets, the septs, the slums. He had wildfire hidden under every major structure in the city. He would rather burn the world than surrender it. It was Jaime Lannister, a member of his own Kingsguard, sworn to protect him, who drove a sword through Aerys's back. Jaime killed the man he swore to protect. He did it to save 1,000,000 lives. History called him Kingslayer, a dishonorable epithet, a mark of shame. Jaime carried it without explanation for years. The wildfire caches beneath King's Landing, they were never fully removed. They sat there, through Robert's reign, through the War of the Five Kings, waiting, a mad king's last gift to a city that outlived him. Robert Baratheon, the king who won and lost everything. Robert Baratheon won the greatest war in a generation and was miserable for every single day of his reign. He was magnificent as a warrior. At the Battle of the Trident, he met Rhaegar Targaryen, the crown prince, considered one of the finest fighters of his age. In single combat in the middle of a river, while thousands of men died around them, Robert killed him, caved in his chest with a warhammer, pulled the rubies from Rhaegar's armor as they scattered into the current. He was 20 years old. He became king because nobody else had the momentum in the alliances to claim the throne. He sat on the Iron Throne because the alternative was chaos. He hated it. Robert Baratheon was a man built for war, sitting in a chair designed for administration. He had no interest in governing. He drank. He hunted. He took mistresses. He fathered bastard children across 7 kingdoms. His wife, Cersei Lannister, despised him. His Hand of the King, Jon Arryn, then Ned Stark, did the actual work of running the kingdom. And underneath the throne, the debts piled up. Robert spent money with the enthusiasm of a man who had never considered that it might run out. By the time of his death, the crown owed the Iron Bank of Braavos and the Lannisters an almost incomprehensible fortune. Robert's power was the power of legend. His name still echoed from the Trident, his physical presence, enormous even as he grew fat, projecting a kind of booming vitality, commanded respect. But legend doesn't pay debts. Legend doesn't manage succession crises. Legend doesn't hold a kingdom together. When Robert died, gored by a boar on a hunt, in circumstances that may not have been entirely accidental, the kingdom he had won shattered almost immediately. Within a year, there were 5 kings claiming the Iron Throne. Robert's greatest failure wasn't his laziness or his drinking. It was that he never built anything meant to outlast him. The War of the Five Kings. Power fragmented. After Robert's death, Westeros fractured. Joffrey Baratheon, cruel, erratic, illegitimate by blood, sat the throne in King's Landing. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's brother, inflexible and self-righteous, claimed the throne by right. Renly Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, charismatic and beloved, claimed the throne by popularity. Robb Stark, never actually claiming the Iron Throne, but declared king in the north, fought for northern independence. Balon Greyjoy, the Iron Islands lord, declared himself king of a saltwater kingdom and raided while everyone else was distracted. 5 kings, 1 throne, an entire continent bleeding. What the War of the Five Kings proved more than anything is that Westeros was never truly unified. Aegon's conquest had put a lid on centuries of division, and the Targaryen dynasty had kept that lid in place. When the dynasty fell, the pressure that had been building underneath exploded. The war killed Renly, Balon, and Robb. It destroyed the Stark family. It razed the Riverlands. It destabilized every major house in the kingdom. And it ended not with a triumphant king riding into a conquered capital, but with exhausted survivors dividing pieces of a ruined continent. The Iron Throne survived. Everything else was negotiable. The kings of the north, power that endured. While dragons flew and thrones changed hands in the south, The North maintained something rarer than conquest: continuity. The Starks of Winterfell ruled the North for 8,000 years before Aegon's conquest. 8,000 years of the same family, in the same castle, with the same words. "Winter is coming," as their house motto. That's not just a dynasty. That's the civilization. The Kings of Winter, as the ancient Stark rulers were called, built their power not on magic or fire, but on something more durable. They were there for their people. When the others, the White Walkers, came from beyond the Wall, in the mythological age, it was the Starks who rallied the living. When winter stretched on for years and food ran short, it was Winterfell's hot springs and deep larders that kept thousands alive. When Southern lords came to conquer, it was the Starks who rallied Northern lords and repelled them. The Night's Watch, the ancient order guarding the Wall against whatever lay beyond, was a direct result of Northern experience and Northern sacrifice. The Wall itself, 700 feet of magic ice, was built by Bran the Builder, the legendary founder of House Stark. Torrhen Stark, the last king in the North before Aegon's conquest, knelt to Aegon rather than watch his people burn. History called him the king who knelt. In the North, they called him the king who loved his people more than his pride. That distinction matters. The North's power was never about conquest. It was about endurance, about being the kind of rulers the people died for, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When Robb Stark was declared king in the North by his bannermen, it wasn't because of inheritance alone. It was because the men around him looked at him and saw his father and his grandfather and 1,000 years of Starks who had kept their word. 8,000 years of kept promises is the most powerful currency in Westeros. What made a king truly powerful? Here is the question this entire history has been building toward. We've seen Aegon, who unified a continent through fire and will. We've seen Jaehaerys, who stabilized it through wisdom and patience. We've seen Maegor, who ruled through terror. We've seen Aerys, who burned it in madness. We've seen Robert, who won everything and built nothing. So what actually made a king powerful in Westeros? It wasn't dragons. Maegor had Balerion and died on his own throne. It wasn't armies. Robert had the finest army in a generation and couldn't hold his kingdom a decade past his victory. It wasn't intelligence. Plenty of intelligent men sat the Iron Throne and left it in chaos. The kings who built lasting power shared three things. First, they understood that ruling is a relationship, not a performance. Jaehaerys traveled his kingdom. He listened. He judged. The Starks were there in winter. The connection between ruler and ruled was personal, sustained, and real. Second, they built institutions that would outlast them. Aegon created the small council. Jaehaerys formalized the legal system. The Starks built Winterfell as a fortress that could shelter thousands. Power that lives only in one person dies with that person. Third, they understood limits. The greatest kings in Westerosi history knew what they couldn't do as well as what they could. Torrhen Stark knelt because he knew his army couldn't beat 3 dragons. That's not weakness, that's the wisdom that saved his people. The kings who failed, they either forgot one of those 3 things or they never learned it in the first place. The throne's true nature. There is one last thing you need to understand about the Iron Throne. It was never meant to be comfortable. Aegon designed it that way, deliberately. A ruler who sits too comfortably stops feeling the edges, stops sensing where the realm is cutting against them, where the sharp places are, where the pain is coming from. The throne that cuts you is the throne that keeps you honest. Every great king in Westerosi history had one thing in common. They bled for their thrones, not metaphorically. The Iron Throne drew blood from everyone who sat it carelessly. And the kings who lasted, the ones remembered as great, were the ones who respected that, who never forgot that ruling a continent of millions was supposed to hurt. The ones who expected ease were the ones who burned it down. Westeros is not a story about who deserved the throne. It's a story about what happens to people when they touch one. That's the complete story, from Aegon's dragons to the ashes of the War of the 5 Kings. Every king, every throne, every choice that built or broke a dynasty. If this is the kind of deep lore breakdown you've been looking for, the real story, not the simplified version, hit that subscribe button right now. Because next we're going into the secrets of the Night's Watch, the truth of the Long Night, and what the Maesters deliberately buried in the archives. Drop a comment below. Aegon the Conqueror or Jaehaerys the Conciliator? Who was the most powerful king Westeros ever had? The conqueror who built the world, or the administrator who made it last? Let's settle this. The history of Westeros is waiting. Don't miss a single episode.